My name is Dante Vos, and I'm a private driver who survived the first 7 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted and blocked out the sun, I had 72 hours to get from Denver to Texas before the roads froze solid. I saved some people and abandoned others. I made choices that still haunt me, but they kept us alive when the world turned into a frozen wasteland. This is exactly what happened during those 7 days, and how my job driving rich clients through Los Angeles traffic became the only reason I lived through humanity's darkest week. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. Tuesday morning started like every other Tuesday for the past 8 years. I woke up at 5:30, checked my phone for client messages, and walked out to my garage to inspect my car. The sedan looked ordinary enough from the outside, but I had spent years modifying it for my work as a private driver. Reinforced frame, extra fuel capacity, hidden compartments, and communication equipment that most people would never notice. My clients paid me well to transport them safely and discreetly through Los Angeles and beyond, and I took that responsibility seriously. I had been driving for Hollywood executives, tech billionaires, and occasionally people who preferred not to discuss their business publicly. The job taught me 3 essential skills that I thought were just professional requirements back then. First, always know at least 3 different routes to any destination. Second, keep emergency supplies in your car at all times. Third, watch everything and say nothing. These skills seemed routine when I was navigating Beverly Hills traffic jams and avoiding paparazzi. I had no idea they would become the difference between life and death. My first client that morning was Mr. Patterson, a venture capitalist who owned offices in downtown Denver. I had been working Colorado contracts for the past 6 months, expanding my business beyond California. Patterson was the kind of client who tipped well and never asked questions about my methods. He just wanted to arrive at his meetings on time and in one piece. I pulled up to his house at 7:15, exactly on schedule. The sky looked strange that morning, but I attributed it to Colorado weather patterns. There were gray clouds building on the horizon, thicker than usual for October. The temperature felt normal for mid-fall in Denver, crisp but not uncomfortable. Patterson climbed into the back seat with his briefcase and immediately started making phone calls. I pulled away from his house and headed toward downtown, taking my usual route through the residential areas before connecting to the main highways. The radio was playing typical morning programming when everything changed. At 7:42, the regular music stopped abruptly. The emergency broadcast system alert tone cut through the car speakers, that harsh electronic sound that makes everyone pay attention. Patterson paused his phone conversation and looked up from his papers. The announcement that followed would replay in my mind for the rest of my life. Yellowstone National Park had experienced a catastrophic volcanic eruption. The supervolcano, which scientists had been monitoring for decades, had finally exploded with unprecedented force. The initial reports described massive ash clouds spreading across the western United States. All flights were grounded immediately. Interstate highways in Wyoming, Montana, and parts of Colorado were being closed due to ashfall and reduced visibility. The National Weather Service was tracking the ash plume, which appeared to be moving eastward at tremendous speed. Patterson ended his phone call and leaned forward in his seat. He asked me what I thought about the situation, whether this would affect his business meetings. I told him honestly that I had never dealt with a volcanic eruption before, but that we should probably monitor the news closely. At that moment, I was still thinking like a professional driver handling a client service issue. The possibility that this event would fundamentally change everything had not yet occurred to me. The ash started falling 20 minutes later. It began as tiny gray particles that looked like snow, except they did not melt when they hit the windshield. I turned on the wipers, but they just smeared the ash across the glass. Within minutes, the accumulation was thick enough to reduce visibility significantly. Other drivers were pulling over to the side of the road, unsure how to handle the conditions. I had driven through heavy snow and sandstorms before, so I adjusted my speed and continued toward downtown. Patterson's phone rang constantly as we drove. His business associates were calling to discuss whether meetings should be postponed or relocated. The stock market was reacting to the news, and several of his investments were fluctuating wildly. He seemed more concerned about his financial portfolio than the growing layer of ash covering the city. I kept driving, but I was starting to feel uneasy about the situation. The radio reports became more frequent and more alarming as the morning progressed. The ash clouds were larger than initially estimated. Entire cities in Wyoming and Montana were reporting complete darkness in the middle of the day. Airports across the region were shutting down indefinitely. The governor of Colorado was declaring a state of emergency and recommending that residents stay indoors unless absolutely necessary. By the time we reached Patterson's office building, the ash was falling heavily enough to coat every surface in gray powder. The building's security guards were discussing whether to close the facility early. Patterson got out of the car and told me to wait for him, that he would probably need a ride home within a few hours. I watched him walk into the building, his expensive suit collecting ash with every step. I spent the next hour sitting in the car, monitoring radio broadcasts and making phone calls to my other clients. Every conversation was the same pattern. People wanted to know if I could drive them out of the city, how much it would cost, and whether the roads were still passable. I found myself quoting rates for emergency transportation services, something I had never done before. The demand was unlike anything I had experienced in my career. The temperature started dropping around noon. The change was subtle at first, just a few degrees that I noticed when I stepped out of the car to clean the windshield. But over the next hour, the decline became more pronounced. The ash was blocking sunlight so effectively that it felt like evening in the middle of the day. I had to turn on my headlights to remain visible to other vehicles. Patterson called me at 1:30 and asked me to come back to his office. When I arrived, he looked genuinely worried for the first time since I had known him. He explained that his business partners in other cities were reporting similar conditions across the entire western region. The ash was not just a local problem affecting Denver. It was a regional catastrophe that was expanding rapidly. He wanted me to drive him to his house so he could pack some belongings and decide whether to leave the city. During the drive, he offered me $5,000 to transport him to Phoenix, where he owned his second home. He said the money would be transferred to my account immediately if I agreed to leave Denver that afternoon. I told him I would consider it, but I needed to assess the road conditions first. The residential areas looked apocalyptic by mid-afternoon. The ash had accumulated several inches deep on every surface. Cars were abandoned in driveways and on streets, their engines clogged with the fine particles. People were walking around wearing makeshift masks made from clothing and towels. The few businesses that remained open had signs posted warning customers about the air quality. Patterson's house was in an upscale neighborhood that normally bustled with activity. Now it was eerily quiet, except for the sound of ash falling on rooftops and the distant hum of emergency vehicles. He went inside to pack while I sat in the car, continuing to monitor the radio broadcasts. The news was getting worse by the hour. Scientists were explaining that the volcanic ash would likely remain in the atmosphere for months, possibly years. The particles were so fine that they would continue to block sunlight even after the initial eruption ended. This would cause global temperatures to drop significantly, potentially triggering what they called a volcanic winter. The term sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the falling temperature outside. Other clients started calling me throughout the afternoon. Everyone wanted the same service that Patterson had requested. They wanted to leave Denver immediately, and they were willing to pay premium rates for safe transportation. A tech executive offered me $8,000 to drive him to Austin. A real estate developer wanted to go to Las Vegas and was prepared to pay $10,000. The amounts were staggering, but something about the desperation in their voices made me hesitant to accept. I had always prided myself on being prepared for emergencies. My car carried enough supplies to handle breakdowns, medical incidents, and unexpected delays. I had first aid kits, emergency food, water, blankets, tools, and extra fuel. These preparations had saved me from difficult situations before, but they had always been temporary problems. A flat tire in the desert, a client medical emergency, or a mechanical failure far from civilization. I had never considered the possibility of a permanent emergency. By 5 o'clock, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees from the morning high. The ash was still falling steadily, and visibility was reduced to about 50 yards. The radio reports indicated that the main highways south of Denver were experiencing heavy traffic as people attempted to evacuate the city. Some routes were already becoming impassable due to the combination of ash accumulation and vehicle breakdowns. Patterson came back to the car with 2 suitcases and a laptop bag. He looked at me seriously and said he was prepared to pay $15,000 for immediate transportation to Phoenix. He emphasized that every hour we delayed would make the journey more dangerous. I could see the fear in his eyes, something I had never observed in him before. This was a man who routinely made million-dollar business decisions without showing emotion, and now he was genuinely frightened. I told him I needed 30 minutes to make a decision. I drove back to my apartment to assess my own situation and gather additional supplies if necessary. The streets were becoming more chaotic as the afternoon progressed. People were loading their cars with belongings, forming convoys with neighbors, and arguing about the best routes to take. The sense of community that typically existed in emergencies was being overwhelmed by individual panic. My apartment building was nearly empty when I arrived. Most of my neighbors had already left or were in the process of evacuating. I went upstairs to my unit and looked out the window at the city below. Denver was disappearing under a blanket of gray ash. The mountains that usually provided a scenic backdrop were completely obscured. Streetlights were turning on automatically, confused by the artificial darkness. I spent 20 minutes gathering additional supplies and thinking about my options. I could accept Patterson's offer and drive him to Phoenix, collecting a substantial fee for what would probably be a difficult but manageable journey. Or I could decline the job and focus on my own evacuation, driving south on my own schedule without the responsibility of protecting a client. Both choices seemed reasonable from a professional standpoint. The decision became clear when I looked at my emergency supplies. I had enough food, water, and fuel to sustain myself for several days, but not enough to support additional passengers for an extended journey. If I took Patterson to Phoenix, I would be committed to that destination regardless of road conditions or unexpected delays. If I traveled alone, I would have more flexibility to adjust my route or find alternative solutions. I called Patterson and told him I could not accept his offer. He was disappointed and asked if I could recommend another driver. I gave him the contact information for 2 colleagues who might be available, though I suspected they were dealing with similar requests from their own clients. He thanked me and said he would try to arrange alternative transportation. After ending the call, I continued monitoring the radio broadcasts. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The ash clouds were expanding faster than initially predicted, and they were moving toward major population centers across the country. Chicago was expecting ashfall within 24 hours. New York was preparing for reduced visibility and air quality problems. The economic implications were staggering, but the immediate concern was the dropping temperature. The temperature had fallen another 10 degrees by 6 o'clock. The combination of blocked sunlight and the cooling effect of the ash particles was creating conditions that meteorologists were comparing to nuclear winter scenarios. The difference was that this event was natural and potentially longer lasting than anything that had been previously modeled. I realized that my decision about Patterson was just the beginning. I needed to make a much more fundamental choice about my own survival. I could stay in Denver and hope that the situation would improve, or I could leave immediately and try to reach a warmer climate before the roads became impassable. The radio report suggested that the window for safe travel was closing rapidly. Looking back, I think the moment when I truly understood the severity of the situation was when I checked the weather forecast on my phone. The predicted low temperature for that night was 20 degrees below what it should have been for October in Denver. The forecast for the following day was even worse. The meteorologists were using words like unprecedented and catastrophic to describe the temperature projections. I made the decision to leave Denver that evening. I loaded my car with every useful item I could carry, including extra clothing, food, tools, and fuel. I had cash reserves hidden in various locations, and I collected as much as possible before departing. The banks were closing early due to the emergency, and I suspected that electronic transactions might become unreliable if the infrastructure continued to deteriorate. The most difficult part of the preparation was deciding what to leave behind. My apartment contained 8 years of accumulated possessions, including furniture, electronics, and personal items that represented my life in Denver. I could only take what fit in my car, so I focused on items that would be essential for survival rather than sentimental value. I was loading the last of my supplies when my phone rang. It was another client, a woman named Sarah, who had hired me for airport transportation several times. She was calling from Denver International Airport, where she had been stranded when all flights were canceled. She offered me $25,000 to drive her to her family in San Diego. The desperation in her voice was heartbreaking, but I knew I could not help her. The roads between Denver and San Diego would be among the most dangerous in the country. The route crossed mountain passes that would be impassable in winter conditions, and the distance was too great for my fuel capacity. Even if I could make the journey, the timeline would extend well beyond the safe travel window. I explained this to Sarah and wished her luck finding alternative transportation. By 7 o'clock, the temperature had dropped to levels that would have been normal for December rather than October. The ash was still falling, and it was beginning to freeze on contact with cold surfaces. The roads were becoming slippery and dangerous, especially for drivers who were not experienced with winter conditions. I knew that if I was going to leave Denver, I needed to do it within the next few hours. I took one last look at my apartment and my old life before getting in the car. The radio was broadcasting evacuation recommendations for the entire Denver metropolitan area. The mayor was advising residents to relocate to warmer climates if possible, but warned that travel conditions were deteriorating rapidly. The National Guard was being mobilized to assist with emergency services and maintain order. As I drove through the city for what I thought might be the last time, I reflected on how quickly everything had changed. 12 hours earlier, I had been a professional driver with a stable business and a comfortable routine. Now I was a refugee preparing to flee from a natural disaster that scientists said could last for years. The skills and preparations that had seemed excessive for my profession were about to become the foundation of my survival strategy. The highway entrance ramps were crowded with vehicles as people attempted to evacuate the city. I could see that traffic was moving slowly, but it was still moving. The ash was reducing visibility significantly, and many drivers were uncertain about how to handle the conditions. I knew from experience that the key to safe travel in adverse conditions was maintaining steady speed and following distance, avoiding sudden movements that could cause loss of control. I had studied maps of the region extensively for my work, and I knew several alternative routes that would be less crowded than the main highways. These back roads would add distance to the journey, but they would also provide better control over my travel schedule and reduce the risk of getting trapped in traffic jams. The extra fuel capacity I had installed in my car would be essential for these longer routes. The radio continued broadcasting updates as I joined the evacuation traffic. The ash clouds were spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, and they were carrying more debris than the initial reports had suggested. Several airports outside the immediate impact zone were closing preemptively to avoid engine damage to aircraft. The ripple effects were reaching far beyond the geographic area of the ashfall. By 8 o'clock, I was committed to leaving Denver. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees, and ice was forming on the road surfaces. The combination of ash moisture and freezing temperatures was creating driving conditions that would challenge even experienced winter drivers. I knew that my window for safe travel was closing rapidly, and that every hour of delay would make the journey more dangerous. The traffic on the highway was moving at about 20 miles per hour, which was frustrating but manageable. I could see the headlights of hundreds of other vehicles ahead of me, all heading south toward warmer climates. The scene reminded me of disaster movies I had watched, except this was real life, and there was no guarantee of a happy ending. I spent the next hour listening to radio broadcasts and planning my route. The reports indicated that the main highways were becoming increasingly congested, and that several routes were already experiencing significant delays. Some drivers were running out of fuel while stuck in traffic, creating additional obstacles for other vehicles. The situation was developing into a transportation crisis that could trap thousands of people in deteriorating conditions. The most troubling information came from weather stations that were tracking the ash cloud movement. The particles were not settling as quickly as expected, and they were maintaining their ability to block sunlight even as they spread across larger areas. This meant that the cooling effect would continue for longer than initially predicted, and that it would affect regions far from the original eruption site. I made the decision to exit the main highway and use secondary roads for my journey south. This choice would require more navigation skills and local knowledge, but it would also provide better control over my travel schedule and reduce the risk of getting trapped in traffic. The extra preparation time I had spent studying Colorado road networks was about to pay dividends I never expected. As I took the exit ramp toward the back roads, I looked in my rearview mirror at the line of headlights stretching into the distance behind me. All of those vehicles contained people who were making the same choice I was making, leaving everything they knew behind and heading toward an uncertain future. The magnitude of the human displacement was staggering, and I knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger crisis. The secondary roads were less crowded, but more challenging to navigate in the reduced visibility. I had to rely on my knowledge of the area and careful attention to road signs to maintain my route. The ash was accumulating more quickly on these smaller roads, and I could feel the car's traction becoming less reliable. The temperature gauge showed that the outside air was now below freezing, which meant that the ash and moisture were creating ice patches on the road surface. I had been driving for 3 hours when I encountered my first major obstacle. A section of road ahead was completely blocked by a jackknifed semi-truck that had apparently lost control on the icy surface. Several cars were backed up behind the accident, and there was no way to pass safely. I was faced with my first major decision of the journey, whether to wait for the road to be cleared or to find an alternative route. The radio traffic reports indicated that similar accidents were occurring throughout the region. The combination of inexperienced drivers, poor visibility, and hazardous road conditions was creating a cascade of problems that would take hours or days to resolve. I realized that waiting for this particular road to be cleared would not solve the underlying problem. I needed to find routes that would be less affected by the mass evacuation traffic. I turned around and headed back toward a secondary road that I remembered from my client trips. This route was longer and more indirect, but it would take me through less populated areas where traffic would be lighter. The trade-off was that I would be farther from emergency services if I encountered problems, but I judged that the reduced traffic risk was worth the isolation. The decision to take the alternate route proved to be correct. The road was nearly empty except for a few other vehicles that had apparently made the same calculation. The driving conditions were still challenging due to the ash and ice, but the lack of traffic congestion made it possible to maintain a steady pace. I was making better time than I had expected, and my fuel consumption was reasonable. As I drove through the rural areas south of Denver, I began to see the full scope of the disaster. Farm buildings were collapsing under the weight of accumulated ash. Livestock were gathered in whatever shelter they could find, but many animals were clearly distressed by the conditions. The landscape looked like a scene from another planet, gray and lifeless under the continuing ashfall. I passed several small towns where the residents were attempting to cope with the situation. People were shoveling ash from their driveways and rooftops, trying to prevent structural damage to their homes. Some had set up makeshift shelters or were preparing to evacuate. The sense of community was strong in these smaller places, with neighbors helping each other prepare for what everyone recognized was going to be a long and difficult period. The radio broadcast continued to provide updates on the expanding disaster. The ash clouds had reached the eastern edge of Colorado and were moving toward Kansas and Nebraska. The temperature drops were being recorded across a much wider area than initially predicted. Several major cities were implementing emergency protocols typically reserved for severe winter storms, even though it was still technically autumn. By midnight, I had been driving for 4 hours and had covered about 100 miles. The progress was slower than normal due to the road conditions, but I was maintaining a steady pace toward the south. The temperature had stabilized at about 10 degrees below freezing, which was cold but manageable with proper preparation. The ashfall was continuing, but it seemed to be lighter than it had been earlier in the day. I was beginning to feel the effects of the stress and concentration required for the difficult driving conditions. The reduced visibility and slippery roads demanded constant attention, and I knew that fatigue would become a safety issue if I continued driving without rest. I needed to find a safe place to stop for a few hours, but most of the usual travel services were closed or overcrowded with other evacuees. I found a truck stop that was still open, though it was packed with vehicles and people dealing with similar situations. The parking lot was full of cars loaded with belongings, families sleeping in their vehicles, and people trying to organize their next moves. The scene reminded me of refugee camps I had seen in news reports, except this was happening in the middle of the American West. I managed to find a parking space and went inside to assess the situation. The truck stop was crowded with travelers who were trying to decide whether to continue south or to find temporary shelter. The staff was overwhelmed, but trying to help people with information about road conditions and available supplies. The atmosphere was tense but not hostile, with everyone recognizing that they were dealing with a shared crisis. I bought some additional food and water, topped off my fuel tank, and checked my car for any damage from the ash exposure. The air filter was clogged with particles, but I had brought spares for exactly this type of situation. The visibility was still poor, but the ashfall seemed to be decreasing slightly. I decided to rest for 2 hours before continuing the journey. Sitting in my car in the truck stop parking lot, I reflected on the events of the past day. 24 hours earlier, I had been a professional driver with a normal routine and predictable challenges. Now I was part of a mass evacuation from a natural disaster that scientists said could change the global climate for years. The emergency supplies and alternative routes that had seemed like professional precautions were now essential survival tools. The radio broadcasts during the early morning hours provided more sobering information. The ash clouds were continuing to expand, and they were carrying more debris than anyone had anticipated. The cooling effect was being recorded across multiple States and weather models were predicting that the temperature drops would continue for at least several more days. The implications for agriculture, energy systems, and transportation were staggering. I also learned that the main highways south of Denver were experiencing severe congestion and multiple accidents. Some routes were effectively closed due to the combination of traffic jams and deteriorating road conditions. The decision to use secondary roads was proving to be correct, but it also meant that I was largely on my own if I encountered problems. By 2 in the morning, I felt rested enough to continue driving. The truck stop was still crowded, but many people had decided to wait until daylight before continuing their journeys. I preferred to travel during the early morning hours when traffic would be lighter and before the ash had time to accumulate on the roads I had already cleared. The next section of my route would take me through mountainous terrain that would be particularly challenging in winter conditions. The elevation changes would affect both the road conditions and my car's performance. I had driven through this area many times during normal weather, but the current situation was unlike anything I had experienced. The combination of ash, ice, and reduced visibility would require careful navigation and constant attention to safety. As I pulled out of the truck stop parking lot, I looked back at the other vehicles and people who were dealing with the same crisis. Everyone was making their own decisions about routes, timing, and destinations based on their individual circumstances and resources. There was no central coordination or official guidance for this type of mass evacuation. We were all essentially on our own, using whatever skills and preparations we had developed over our lifetimes. The radio continued broadcasting updates as I drove through the early morning darkness. The temperature was holding steady at about 10 degrees below normal, which was cold, but not life-threatening with proper preparation. The ash fall was decreasing in intensity, but the particles that were already in the atmosphere would continue to block sunlight for an extended period. The long-term implications were still unknown, but the immediate priority was getting to a safer location. I was approaching the most challenging section of my route when I encountered the first sign of what would become a much larger problem. There were other vehicles on the road, but they were not following normal traffic patterns. Some were driving much too slowly for the conditions, while others were taking dangerous risks to make up time. The stress of the situation was causing people to make poor decisions that created additional hazards for everyone. I reached the edge of the mountain pass just as the sun should have been rising, but there was no sun visible through the thick ash clouds. The sky remained that same gray color it had been since Tuesday afternoon, like being trapped inside a dirty snow globe. The temperature gauge in my car showed 18 degrees below zero, which was colder than most Denver winters I had experienced. The road ahead wound through terrain that would be treacherous under normal conditions, and these were far from normal conditions. The first thing I noticed was the abandoned vehicles. Cars and trucks sat on the shoulder of the road, some with their doors open, others completely buried under ash accumulation. Most looked like they had been there for several hours, which meant their occupants had either found alternative transportation or were walking. The sight of those empty vehicles was more disturbing than I wanted to admit, because it suggested that my route might not be as safe as I had hoped. I drove carefully past the abandoned cars, noting that most of them appeared to be standard passenger vehicles without the modifications I had made to my sedan. The ash had clogged their air filters and engines, or they had simply run out of fuel while stuck in traffic. My extra fuel capacity and spare filters were already proving their worth, but I knew that even my preparations had limits. The radio was broadcasting emergency updates every 15 minutes, and the news was getting worse. The ash clouds had reached as far east as Kansas City, and temperatures were dropping across the entire Midwest. Chicago was reporting snow mixed with ash, creating a gray slush that was impossible to clear from the roads. New York was preparing for the ash cloud to arrive within 24 hours. and the mayor was recommending that residents stockpile food and water for an extended emergency. Period. What made the news particularly disturbing was the admission from government officials that they had underestimated the severity of the situation. The volcanic eruption was larger than anything in recorded history, and the ash clouds were behaving differently than computer models had predicted. Instead of settling quickly, the particles were staying suspended in the atmosphere and continuing to block sunlight across vast areas. The cooling effect was more intense and longer lasting than anyone had anticipated. I was concentrating on navigating a particularly steep section of road when I encountered my first other survivors of the evacuation. A family was standing beside their broken-down SUV, waving at passing vehicles for help. There were 4 people, including 2 children who looked to be about 8 and 10 years old. They were wearing winter coats, but I could see that they were not properly equipped for the current conditions. I stopped and rolled down my window to talk to them. The father, who introduced himself as Miguel Martinez, explained that their vehicle had overheated and died about an hour earlier. They had been walking toward the nearest town, but the distance was too far for the children to manage in the cold and ash. Miguel asked if I could give them a ride to safety, and he offered to pay whatever I charged for the service. This was the first major decision I had to make during the evacuation. My car was designed for privacy and security, not passenger capacity. I could fit the family, but it would be crowded and would reduce my supply storage space. More importantly, taking passengers would commit me to their destination preferences and timeline, which might not align with my own survival strategy. I looked at the children, who were clearly cold and frightened, and made a decision that would affect everything that happened over the next several days. I told Miguel that I could take his family south, but that I could not guarantee a specific destination or timeline. I explained that I was heading toward warmer climates and that I would help them as far as my route allowed. Miguel accepted immediately, and they quickly gathered their essential belongings from their SUV. The Martinez family squeezed into my car, with the children in the back seat and Miguel's wife Maria in the front passenger seat. They had been driving from Denver toward her sister's house in Albuquerque when their car broke down. Miguel worked in construction, and Maria was a nurse at a local hospital. They were practical people who understood the severity of the situation and were grateful for any assistance I could provide. Having passengers changed the dynamic of my evacuation completely. I was no longer just responsible for my own survival. Decisions. I had to consider the needs and safety of 4 other people, including 2 children who were depending on me to get them to safety. The weight of that responsibility was heavier than I had expected, and it made me realize how isolated I had been in my previous mindset. Maria proved to be an immediate asset to our group. As a nurse, she had medical supplies and knowledge that complemented my emergency preparations. She also had a calm demeanor that helped keep the children from panicking about the situation. Miguel had construction experience that would be useful if we needed to make repairs or find shelter. The family brought skills that I did not have, but they also brought needs that would stretch my resources. The radio broadcast continued to provide updates on the expanding disaster. The ash clouds were now affecting an area larger than Texas, and the temperature drops were being recorded across multiple time zones. Several major cities were implementing emergency protocols, and the National Guard was being deployed to assist with evacuation efforts. The economic implications were staggering, with stock markets closed and major industries shutting down operations. We continued driving south through the mountain pass, making slow but steady progress. The road conditions were challenging, with ice forming wherever the ash mixed with moisture. I had to maintain constant attention to steering and braking, while also monitoring the radio for updates on road conditions ahead. The Martinez family was quiet, understanding that I needed to concentrate on driving safely. About 2 hours after picking up the Martinez family, we encountered our first major traffic obstacle. The highway ahead was completely blocked by a massive pileup involving at least 20 vehicles. Cars, trucks, and recreational vehicles were scattered across both lanes of the road, with some vehicles off the shoulder and others turned completely. Around, there was no way to pass safely, and no emergency vehicles were visible at the scene. I stopped the car about 50 yards from the accident and got out to assess the situation. The pileup appeared to be the result of multiple vehicles losing control on the icy road surface. Most of the cars were empty, suggesting that the occupants had either been rescued or had continued on foot. There were a few people moving around the wreckage, but they seemed to be salvaging supplies rather than waiting for help. Miguel joined me in examining the roadblock. He pointed out that some of the vehicles could potentially be moved if we could find enough people to help push them off the road. However, the ice conditions made it dangerous to attempt moving heavy vehicles, and we would need cooperation from other stranded drivers. The alternative was to find a detour route, which would add significant distance and time to our journey. I made the decision to look for an alternative route rather than spend time trying to clear the roadblock. The radio traffic reports indicated that similar accidents were occurring throughout the region, and clearing one obstruction would not solve the underlying problem. We needed to find roads that were less affected by the mass evacuation traffic and the deteriorating weather conditions. I retrieved my paper maps from the car and spread them across the hood to study our options. The GPS system was working, but I preferred paper maps for route planning because they provided a better overview of the terrain and alternative routes. Miguel and Maria looked over my shoulder as I traced possible detours around the blocked highway. There were several secondary roads that could take us around the accident site, but they would require driving through more rural areas where services would be limited. The roads would also be less maintained and potentially more dangerous in winter conditions. However, they would also be less crowded with evacuation traffic, which might make them faster overall despite the longer distance. I decided to try a county road that paralleled the main highway about 10 miles to the east. This route would add about 30 miles to our journey, but it would take us through farming communities where we might be able to find fuel and supplies. The road was also less likely to be blocked by major accidents, since it would primarily be used by local traffic. We got back in the car and backtracked to the county road junction. The Martinez children were asking questions about why we were changing directions, and Maria was explaining the situation to them in calm, reassuring terms. She had clearly dealt with emergency situations before and knew how to maintain morale during stressful circumstances. The county road was indeed less crowded, but it was also less well-maintained. The ash accumulation was deeper on the smaller road, and there were no road crews working to clear the surface. I had to drive more slowly and carefully, using the car's weight distribution and traction control systems to maintain stability. The extra fuel capacity I had installed was becoming essential, as the difficult driving conditions were increasing consumption significantly. We passed through several small farming communities that were dealing with the ashfall in their own ways. Some residents were attempting to clear the ash from their property, while others were boarding up windows and preparing for an extended emergency period. A few people waved at us as we drove through, probably recognizing that we were evacuees heading towards safety. The radio broadcasts during the late morning hours provided more disturbing information. The ash clouds were continuing to expand, and they were now affecting areas as far east as Chicago and as far north as Canada. The temperature drops were being recorded across an area covering most of North America. This was no longer a regional disaster affecting the western United States. It was a continental crisis that would impact millions of people. The most troubling news was that the volcanic activity at Yellowstone was continuing. Scientists were reporting ongoing seismic activity and additional ash emissions, which suggested that the eruption was not a single event, but rather the beginning of an extended period of volcanic activity. The ash clouds would continue to grow and spread for an indefinite period, potentially lasting months or years. I was processing this information when Maria pointed out that we were running low on fuel. The difficult driving conditions and the detour route had consumed more gas than I had anticipated. We needed to find a fuel source within the next 50 miles, or we would be stranded in the rural area we were crossing. The extra fuel capacity I had installed was keeping us mobile, but it was not unlimited. We found a small gas station in a farming community that was still operating, though the owner was charging premium prices for fuel. The station was crowded with other evacuees who were dealing with similar fuel shortages. The owner explained that his supply trucks had not been able to make deliveries due to the road conditions, and he was rationing fuel to ensure that as many people as possible could get enough to continue their journeys. I paid the inflated price for fuel and bought additional food and water supplies. The Martinez family also purchased supplies with their own money, contributing to our group resources. Miguel struck up conversations with other travelers, gathering information about road conditions and alternative routes. The informal network of evacuees was sharing valuable information that was not available through official channels. One piece of information that Miguel gathered was particularly important. Several drivers reported that the main highways further south were experiencing severe congestion and fuel shortages. Some routes were effectively closed due to a combination of traffic jams and accidents. The secondary roads we were using might actually be faster than the major highways, despite the longer distances and more difficult driving conditions. We left the gas station and continued south on the county road. The ashfall was lighter than it had been during the night, but the temperature was still well below normal for the region and season. The radio weather reports indicated that the Pafaiwingo cooling effect would continue for several more days, with no improvement expected in the near term. The children were becoming restless during the long drive, and Maria was working to keep them occupied and calm. She had brought books and games from their car, and she was using them to maintain a sense of normalcy for the kids. Miguel was monitoring the radio and studying the maps, helping me plan our route and identify potential obstacles ahead. About 50 miles south of the gas station, we encountered another group of evacuees who were experiencing mechanical problems. A convoy of 3 vehicles had stopped beside the road, and people were working on one of the cars that appeared to have engine problems. The group included about 12 people, including several elderly individuals who were clearly struggling with the cold and stress. I stopped to assess the situation and determine if we could provide assistance. The convoy leader, an older man named Frank, explained that one of their vehicles had engine problems that they could not fix with available tools and parts. They were trying to decide whether to abandon the vehicle and redistribute the passengers among the remaining cars, or to wait for professional help that might never arrive. Frank's group had been traveling together since leaving Denver, and they had been helping each other with fuel, food, and navigation. The cooperation was admirable, but it also meant that the mechanical failure of one vehicle affected the entire group. Frank asked if I could take some of their passengers, particularly the elderly individuals who were most vulnerable to the cold conditions. This was another decision point that would affect our journey significantly. Taking additional passengers would further strain our resources and reduce our flexibility. However, leaving vulnerable people in dangerous conditions would be difficult to live with, particularly if they did not survive the experience. I found myself weighing practical survival considerations against moral obligations. I decided to take 2 of the elderly passengers, a couple named Harold and Dorothy, who were in their 70s. They were traveling light and seemed to be in reasonable health, but they were clearly struggling with the cold and stress of the evacuation. Frank was grateful for the assistance and gave me contact information for their destination in case we became separated. Harold and Dorothy squeezed into the back seat with the Martinez children, making the car crowded but manageable. Dorothy had been a teacher for 40 years and immediately began helping Maria keep the children calm and occupied. Harold had been a mechanic and offered to help with any car problems we might encounter. The additional passengers brought both skills and needs to our group. The convoy continued with their remaining vehicles, and we continued on our route. The car was now carrying 6 people plus supplies, which was near the maximum capacity for safe travel. The weight was affecting the car's handling and fuel efficiency, but the vehicle was still performing adequately for the road conditions. We drove through the afternoon, making steady progress toward the south. The ashfall was becoming lighter and more intermittent, but the temperature was remaining well below normal. The radio broadcasts indicated that the cooling effect was stabilizing rather than continuing to worsen, which was encouraging news. However, the temperatures were still life-threatening for people without proper shelter and supplies. The rural areas we were crossing were experiencing the disaster in different ways than the urban areas. Farmers were dealing with livestock that needed shelter and feed, while rural residents were more self-sufficient and better prepared for extended emergencies. Some communities had organized mutual aid networks that were sharing resources and information effectively. We stopped at another small town to purchase additional supplies and fuel. The local residents were helpful and sympathetic to evacuees, but they were also concerned about their own long-term survival if the emergency continued for an extended period. The town's mayor was organizing rationing systems and emergency shelters, but the resources were limited. The radio broadcasts during the late afternoon provided some encouraging news mixed with continued warnings. The ash emissions from Yellowstone were decreasing, which suggested that the eruption might be entering a less active phase. However, the ash already in the atmosphere would continue to affect weather patterns for months or years. The immediate crisis was stabilizing, but the long-term implications were still severe. I was beginning to feel the effects of driving for extended periods under stressful conditions. The concentration required for safe travel in the ash and ice conditions was mentally exhausting, and I knew that fatigue would become a safety issue if I continued without adequate rest. However, I also knew that every hour of delay made our journey more dangerous as fuel and supplies became scarcer. The Martinez family and Harold and Dorothy were also showing signs of stress and fatigue. The children were becoming cranky and restless while the adults were dealing with anxiety about their uncertain future. Maria was doing an excellent job maintaining group morale, but I could see that everyone was being affected by the prolonged emergency situation. We found a truck stop that was still operating and decided to stop for several hours to rest and resupply. The facility was crowded with other evacuees, creating a temporary community of people dealing with similar challenges. The atmosphere was tense but cooperative, with people sharing information and resources as needed. I used the stop time to check my car for any problems caused by the ash exposure and difficult driving conditions. The air filter needed to be changed again, and I had to clean ash buildup from several engine components. The modifications I had made to the car were holding up well, but they required maintenance to continue functioning effectively. Miguel and Harold helped me with the car maintenance, while Maria and Dorothy organized our supplies and planned meals for the group. The cooperation was working well, and I was beginning to appreciate the advantages of traveling with other people, despite the additional complications and resource requirements. The radio broadcasts during the evening hours provided updates on the expanding scope of the disaster. The ash clouds had reached the East Coast, and cities like Boston and Washington were preparing for reduced visibility and air quality problems. The economic implications were becoming clearer, with estimates suggesting that the disruption would last for months and cost trillions of dollars in lost productivity and recovery efforts. The most significant news was that the federal government was establishing refugee camps in southern states to accommodate the millions of people evacuating from the affected areas. The camps would provide temporary housing, food, and medical care for evacuees who could not find other accommodations. However, the camps had limited capacity and resources, and priority was being given to families with children and elderly or disabled individuals. This information was relevant to our group because it suggested that we would have options for shelter and support if we could reach the southern states. However, it also indicated that the competition for resources would be intense and that early arrival would be advantageous. The motivation to continue our journey quickly was strong, but so was the need to travel safely and maintain our vehicle and supplies. I decided to rest for 4 hours before continuing our journey. The truck stop parking lot was full of vehicles and people dealing with similar situations, creating a temporary community of evacuees. The shared experience was creating bonds among strangers, and people were helping each other with information, supplies, and emotional support. The radio continued broadcasting updates throughout the night. The ash clouds were continuing to spread, but the rate of expansion was slowing. The temperature drops were stabilizing rather than continuing to worsen, which suggested that the immediate crisis might be reaching a plateau. However, the long-term implications were still unknown, and the recovery timeline was measured in years rather than months. I spent some time talking with other evacuees about their experiences and plans. The stories were similar to our own, with people making difficult decisions about routes, resources, and priorities. Everyone was dealing with uncertainty about the future and trying to balance immediate survival needs with longer-term planning. The most valuable information I gathered was about road conditions and resource availability along various southern routes. Several drivers had attempted different routes and could provide first-hand reports about traffic congestion, fuel availability, and road hazards. This information was more current and reliable than official reports, which were often delayed or incomplete. By midnight, I felt rested enough to continue our journey. The truck stop was still crowded, but many people had decided to wait until morning before continuing their travels. I preferred to drive during the early morning hours when traffic would be lighter and before new ash accumulation made the roads more hazardous. The Martinez family and Harold and Dorothy were tired but ready to continue. The children had slept for a few hours and were in better spirits. The adults were anxious to continue making progress toward safety, understanding that each day of delay made our situation more precarious. As we prepared to leave the truck stop, I reflected on how much had changed since leaving Denver. I had started the journey as a lone evacuee focused on my own survival. Now I was responsible for a group of 6 people, including 2 children and 2 elderly adults. The responsibility was challenging, but it was also giving me a sense of purpose that made the difficult journey more meaningful. The radio broadcasts as we resumed driving provided more information about the scale of the evacuation. Millions of people were leaving their homes in the affected areas, creating the largest population displacement in American history. The transportation infrastructure was overwhelmed, and many routes were experiencing severe congestion and resource shortages. The road ahead would take us through more mountainous terrain before reaching the relatively flat areas of New Mexico and Texas. The elevation changes would be challenging for our heavily loaded vehicle, and the cold temperatures would make any mechanical problems more dangerous. However, we were making steady progress toward warmer climates and safer conditions. I was beginning to understand that this journey was not just about reaching a destination. It was about learning to survive in a fundamentally changed world. The skills and resources that had seemed adequate for normal emergencies were being stretched to their limits by the unprecedented scope of the disaster. The cooperation and mutual support among evacuees was becoming as important as individual preparation and skills. The road stretched ahead into the gray dawn of what would be our 3rd day since leaving Denver. The ash was still falling lightly, and the temperature was still well below normal, but we were making progress toward safety. The radio broadcasts continued to provide updates on the expanding disaster, but they also included stories of successful evacuations and communities that were adapting to the new conditions. As we drove through the early morning hours, I thought about the decisions that had brought us to this point and the challenges that lay ahead. The evacuation was far from over, and we would face many more difficult choices before reaching safety. However, I was beginning to believe that we had the skills, resources, and determination to survive this crisis and help others do the same. The emergency broadcast system alert tone cut through the car speakers just as we were approaching the New Mexico border. The announcement that followed would change everything about our journey and force us to make decisions that would test every skill and resource we had developed over the past 3 days. The emergency broadcast alert that cut through our car speakers at dawn on Thursday morning contained information that made my blood run colder than the freezing air outside. The announcer's voice was steady but urgent as he delivered news that would fundamentally change our evacuation strategy. The volcanic activity at Yellowstone was not decreasing as scientists had hoped. Instead, seismic monitoring stations were detecting increased underground activity that suggested additional major eruptions were imminent. More critically for our immediate situation, the ash clouds were moving faster and in different directions than the computer models had predicted. The cooling effect was accelerating rather than stabilizing, and the ice sheets that were forming in the northern regions were expanding southward at approximately 50 miles per day. Weather stations across Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana were reporting temperatures dropping to levels that would be fatal for anyone without proper shelter and heating. The government meteorologists were now predicting that the habitable zone would shift dramatically southward over the next several days. Areas that were currently experiencing manageable cold conditions would become uninhabitable within 72 hours. The safe evacuation window was closing much faster than anyone had anticipated, and millions of people were still trapped in the danger zone. I pulled over to the side of the road to fully absorb this information and discuss our options with the rest of our group. Miguel, Maria, Harold, and Dorothy listened intently as I explained what the broadcast meant for our journey. The children, who had been sleeping in the back seat, woke up and sensed the tension in the adult conversation. Maria, with her medical background, immediately understood the implications. Exposure to the temperatures being predicted would cause hypothermia and death within hours for anyone without adequate protection. Our car provided some shelter, but it would not be sufficient if we became stranded in the open during the worst of the temperature drop. We needed to reach the refugee camps in Texas or Arizona before the deadly cold caught up with us. Harold, drawing on his decades of mechanical experience, pointed out that our heavily loaded car was already showing signs of strain from the difficult driving conditions. The engine was working harder than normal due to the ash contamination and the additional weight of 6 passengers plus supplies. If we experienced a major mechanical failure in the wrong location at the wrong time, we could all freeze to death before help arrived. The radio continued broadcasting updated evacuation routes and warnings about road conditions. Several major highways had been closed due to accidents and weather conditions, forcing evacuees onto secondary roads that were becoming increasingly congested. Fuel shortages were being reported at stations along all the major evacuation routes, and some communities were restricting fuel sales to local residents only. I realized that our strategy of using back roads and avoiding major highways had been correct, but it would need to be accelerated. We could not afford to stop for extended rest periods or to help other stranded evacuees. Every hour of delay increased the risk that the deadly cold would overtake us before we reached safety. The comfortable buffer time I had calculated for our journey had been eliminated by the faster-than-expected progression of the disaster. Miguel suggested that we pool our remaining cash to purchase as much fuel as possible at the next gas station, regardless of the price. Maria recommended that we also buy additional food and warm clothing, since we might need to survive in the car for extended periods if we encountered impassable roads. Harold wanted to purchase spare parts and tools that might be needed for emergency repairs. Dorothy, who had been quiet during most of the discussion, made an observation that proved to be more insightful than I initially realized. She pointed out that our group had been fortunate so far, but that our luck might not continue. Other evacuees were becoming more desperate as resources became scarcer and the danger increased. We might encounter people who would try to take our car or supplies by force, especially if they had families to protect and no other options. This was a possibility I had been trying not to think about, but Dorothy was right to raise it. The social cooperation that had characterized the early stages of the evacuation was beginning to break down as the situation became more desperate. The radio reports were starting to include warnings about robberies and conflicts at gas stations and supply stops. The breakdown of normal social order was an additional threat that we would need to consider in our planning. We resumed driving with a new sense of urgency. The radio broadcast continued to provide updates on the deteriorating situation, and each report made it clear that we were in a race against time. The ice sheets were expanding faster than predicted. Fuel supplies were running out across the region, and the transportation infrastructure was beginning to collapse under the strain of the mass evacuation. The road conditions were becoming more treacherous as we progressed south. The ash accumulation was deeper on the secondary roads we were using, and the temperature was cold enough to turn any moisture into ice instantly. I had to reduce our speed significantly to maintain control of the vehicle, which was frustrating given our need to make maximum progress toward safety. We encountered our first fuel shortage about 50 miles south of the New Mexico border. The gas station we had planned to use was completely out of fuel, with handwritten signs posted on the pumps explaining that their supply trucks had been unable to make deliveries. A dozen other vehicles were parked around the station, with their occupants trying to decide what to do next. The station attendant was helpful despite the circumstances, providing information about other fuel sources in the area. He explained that a truck stop about 20 miles further south still had fuel as of the previous evening, but that supplies were limited and expensive. He also warned us that the competition for fuel was becoming intense, with some customers becoming aggressive when stations ran out of supplies. This was our first direct encounter with the resource scarcity that would define the later stages of our evacuation. The fuel shortage forced us to recalculate our route and consumption carefully. With our current supply, we could reach the truck stop the attendant had mentioned, but we would need to find fuel there or risk becoming stranded in an increasingly dangerous area. The drive to the truck stop took us through terrain that showed the full impact of the disaster. Abandoned vehicles were becoming more common, and we passed several groups of people walking along the road carrying whatever supplies they could manage. The sight of families with young children walking through the freezing ashfall was heartbreaking, but I knew that stopping to help would jeopardize our own survival chances. The truck stop was still operating when we arrived, but the scene was chaotic. Dozens of vehicles were lined up at the fuel pumps, and tensions were running high among the customers. The fuel prices had increased dramatically since our last stop, and the station was rationing sales to prevent any single customer from taking more than their fair share. Armed security guards were present to maintain order and prevent conflicts. I waited in line for over an hour to purchase fuel, during which time I witnessed several heated arguments between customers and staff. The stress of the evacuation was causing people to behave in ways they normally would not consider. The social fabric that normally held communities together was fraying under the pressure of the emergency situation. While I was dealing with the fuel purchase, Miguel and Harold explored the truck stop to gather information about road conditions ahead. They learned that the main highways further south were experiencing severe congestion, with some routes completely blocked by accidents and abandoned vehicles. However, They also discovered that there were additional secondary roads that could take us around the worst of the traffic problems. Maria and Dorothy used the stop to purchase additional food and supplies, focusing on items that would provide maximum nutrition and warmth if we became stranded. Dorothy's teaching experience proved valuable in keeping the children calm and occupied during the stressful refueling process. The cooperation among our group members was becoming more important as external conditions became more challenging. The most valuable information we gathered at the truck stop came from other evacuees who had attempted different routes south. A family from Colorado Springs reported that the eastern routes through Kansas were experiencing blizzard conditions that made travel impossible. A couple from Denver had tried the western routes through Utah and found them blocked by massive traffic jams and fuel shortages. However, a truck driver who regularly traveled through the region recommended a series of state highways that could take us through rural New Mexico and into Texas while avoiding the worst of the congestion. The route would be longer and more indirect, but it would also be less crowded and more likely to have available fuel and supplies. The driver emphasized that speed was essential, as the weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly along all routes. I made the decision to follow the truck driver's recommendation, even though it would add significant distance to our journey. The alternative routes were becoming impassable, and the secondary roads offered our best chance of reaching safety before the deadly cold overtook us. The extra fuel I had purchased at the inflated prices would be essential for the longer route. We left the truck stop and headed southwest on state highways that took us through sparsely populated areas of New Mexico. The landscape was stark and beautiful under normal conditions, but the ash fall had transformed it into an alien environment. The normally blue sky was gray, and the distinctive red rock formations were coated with volcanic debris that made them look like mountains. On another planet, the radio broadcast during the early afternoon provided more disturbing news about the progression of the disaster. The ice sheets were continuing to expand southward, and several cities in Colorado and Wyoming were being completely evacuated as they became uninhabitable. The refugee camps in Texas and Arizona were becoming overcrowded, and new camps were being established as quickly as possible to accommodate the millions of displaced people. The most troubling information was that the transportation infrastructure was beginning to fail in systematic ways. Major highways were becoming impassable due to the combination of weather conditions and the sheer volume of evacuation traffic. Fuel distribution networks were breaking down as supply trucks could not reach their destinations safely. Communication systems were being affected by the ash clouds, making coordination of relief efforts increasingly difficult. We drove through the afternoon, making steady progress despite the challenging conditions. The ash fall was lighter in the areas we were crossing, but the temperature was still well below normal. The radio weather reports indicated that we were staying ahead of the worst of the temperature drop, but the margin of safety was decreasing with each hour of delay. The secondary roads we were using took us through small towns and rural communities that were dealing with the disaster in their own ways. Some towns had organized effective mutual aid networks that were helping both residents and evacuees. Others appeared to be struggling with resource shortages and the sudden influx of desperate travelers. The variation in community responses was striking and would prove to be important for our survival. We stopped in a small town called Carrizozo to purchase supplies and fuel. The local gas station was still operating, though supplies were limited and prices were high. The town residents were friendly but clearly concerned about their own long-term survival if the emergency continued for an extended period. The mayor had organized a rationing system that ensured both locals and evacuees could access essential supplies. While we were in Carrizozo, I overheard a conversation between local residents that made me realize how much the situation had deteriorated in areas we had left behind. They had been in contact with relatives in Denver who reported that the city was becoming uninhabitable. The temperature had dropped below zero, the ash accumulation was several feet deep, and the electrical grid was failing. Anyone who had not evacuated was now trapped and in serious danger. This information reinforced my belief that our decision to leave Denver early had been correct, but it also highlighted how quickly conditions could change. The areas we were currently crossing might become equally dangerous within days if the cooling trend continued. Our race against time was more urgent than I had initially realized. The radio broadcast during the late afternoon included the first reports of serious conflicts among evacuees. Several incidents of robbery and violence had been reported at gas stations and supply stops along major evacuation routes. The breakdown of social order was accelerating as people became more desperate and resources became scarcer. The warnings about potential violence that Dorothy had mentioned earlier were proving to be prophetic. We continued driving through the evening, making good progress on the state highways. The traffic was much lighter than on the major routes, and we encountered fewer abandoned vehicles and accident sites. The strategy of using secondary roads was working, but it required constant attention to navigation and route planning. The GPS system was becoming less reliable as communication networks were affected by the ash clouds. Miguel proved to be valuable in navigation, as his construction work had required him to travel throughout the region and he was familiar with many of the roads we were using. Harold's mechanical knowledge was becoming increasingly important as the car showed more signs of straying from the difficult conditions. Maria's medical background and calm demeanor were essential for maintaining group morale as stress levels increased. As darkness fell, we faced a decision about whether to continue driving through the night or to find a safe place to rest. The radio reports indicated that the deadly cold was still approximately 12 hours behind us, which meant we had some buffer time if we needed to stop. However, the fuel and supply shortages were becoming more severe, and any delay would reduce our options for completing the journey. I decided to continue driving through the night, reasoning that the reduced traffic would allow us to make better time and that the early morning hours would be safer for refueling stops. The decision proved to be correct in terms of travel efficiency, but it also meant that we were pushing the limits of both our vehicle and our physical endurance. The overnight drive took us through some of the most remote areas of our journey. We passed through regions where there were no towns or services for 50 miles at a stretch. The isolation was both advantageous and dangerous. We avoided the conflicts and resource competition that were occurring in more populated areas, but we were also completely on our own if we experienced mechanical problems. During one of these remote stretches, we encountered a situation that would test everything we had learned about survival and cooperation. We came across a broken-down car on the side of the road, with a family standing beside it in the freezing ashfall. The family included 3 young children and an elderly man who was clearly suffering from the cold. They had been stranded for several hours and were in serious danger of hypothermia. This was the most difficult decision I had faced during the entire evacuation. Our car was already carrying its maximum safe capacity, and taking additional passengers would strain our resources and potentially jeopardize our own survival. However, leaving a family with young children to freeze to death was morally unacceptable. The choice represented the fundamental tension between individual survival and community responsibility that defined the entire crisis. I stopped the car and got out to assess the situation. The family was from El Paso and had been trying to reach relatives in Oklahoma when their car died. The father was a mechanic who had tried everything he could think of to repair the vehicle, but the engine had been damaged by ash contamination and could not be fixed with available tools. They had been walking toward the nearest town, but the distance was too far for the children and elderly man to manage in the current conditions. Harold joined me in examining their car and confirmed that the engine damage was beyond field repair. The family would need to abandon the vehicle and find alternative transportation if they were going to survive. The father was willing to pay whatever I charged for transportation, but he also understood that space was limited and that I might not be able to help all of them. This was the moment when the abstract ethical questions about survival became concrete and immediate. I had to choose between maintaining the safety margins that protected my existing passengers and accepting additional risk to save strangers. The decision would affect not only the stranded family, but also the people who were already depending on me for their survival. I made a decision that reflected both practical necessity and moral obligation. I could take the 3 children and elderly man, but the parents would need to continue on foot toward the nearest town. It was not a perfect solution, but it would save the most vulnerable members of the family while maintaining reasonable safety margins for the rest of our group. The father accepted immediately, understanding that any rescue was better than no rescue. The separation of the family was emotionally difficult for everyone involved. The children were frightened about being separated from their parents, and the parents were anguished about sending their children with strangers. However, everyone understood that this was the best option available under the circumstances. Maria and Dorothy immediately began caring for the new children, while Harold helped transfer essential supplies from the abandoned car. Our group now included 10 people in a car designed for 5 passengers. The crowding was extreme, and our supply margins were stretched to the breaking point. However, we had saved 4 lives and given them a chance to reach safety. The moral weight of the decision felt heavy, but it was also clarifying. This crisis was teaching us all about the real meaning of community and mutual responsibility. The radio continued broadcasting updates as we drove through the pre-dawn hours. The ice sheets were continuing to expand southward, and the deadly cold was now affecting areas that had been safe just 24 hours earlier. The refugee camps were becoming increasingly overcrowded, and resources were being stretched thin by the massive influx of evacuees. The competition for shelter and supplies was becoming intense. As the sun should have been rising on Friday morning, the sky remained the same gray color it had been for the past 3 days. The ash clouds were still blocking most of the sunlight, and the temperature was remaining well below normal. However, we were making steady progress toward Texas and the relative safety of the refugee camps. The radio reports indicated that we were still ahead of the worst of the temperature drop, but the margin was continuing to decrease. We approached a major decision point as we neared the Texas border. The radio traffic reports indicated that the main routes into the refugee camps were experiencing severe congestion, with vehicles backed up for miles. However, I had learned about alternative routes that might be less crowded, but would also be less certain in terms of reaching our destination. The choice would determine whether we spent the next several hours in traffic jams or took risks on unknown roads. The emergency broadcast system alert tone cut through our car speakers once again, just as we were approaching the Texas border. The announcement that followed would force us to make the most critical decisions of our entire evacuation, decisions that would test every skill and resource we had developed over the past 4 days. The emergency broadcast that interrupted our drive to the Texas border contained the most chilling information we had heard since leaving Denver. The announcer reported that seismic activity at Yellowstone had intensified dramatically, and scientists were now predicting a secondary eruption within the next 24 hours. This second eruption would be larger than the first and would send additional massive ash clouds across the continent. The ice sheets that were already expanding southward would accelerate their movement, potentially reaching as far south as central Texas within 72 hours. More immediately threatening was the news that several major refugee camps were closing their intake due to overcrowding and resource shortages. The camps in northern Texas and southern New Mexico were no longer accepting new arrivals, forcing evacuees to continue south toward facilities that were already operating beyond capacity. The competition for shelter and supplies was becoming desperate, and conflicts were being reported at multiple locations. I pulled over to discuss this development with our group. We now had 10 people crammed into my car, including Harold, Dorothy, the Martinez family, and the 3 children and elderly man we had rescued from the broken-down vehicle. Our fuel supplies were adequate to reach the Texas refugee camps, but if those facilities were closed, we would need to continue toward camps that were hundreds of miles further south. Miguel suggested that we try to reach the camps anyway, hoping that they might make exceptions for families with children. Maria pointed out that our group included 6 children and 2 elderly adults, which might give us priority even if the camps were officially closed. Harold was concerned about our car's ability to handle additional hundreds of miles of difficult driving with such a heavy load. The radio continued broadcasting updates about the deteriorating situation. The main highways leading to the refugee camps were experiencing gridlock traffic that extended for dozens of miles. Fuel shortages were being reported at every major stop along the evacuation routes. Most critically, the weather reports indicated that the deadly cold was moving south faster than anyone had predicted, potentially overtaking the traffic jams before vehicles could reach safety. I made the decision to attempt reaching the camps using alternative routes rather than joining the gridlock on the main highways. My knowledge of secondary roads would be essential for this strategy, but it would also mean traveling through areas where help would not be available if we encountered problems. The risk was significant, but the alternative of sitting in traffic while the deadly cold approached seemed worse. We resumed driving toward Texas, but I chose state highways that paralleled the main routes rather than the interstates where most evacuees were traveling. The secondary roads were less crowded, but also less well-maintained, especially under fire. The current conditions. The ash accumulation was deeper, and there were no road crews working to clear the surfaces or assist stranded vehicles. About 30 miles from the first refugee camp, we encountered our first sign of the social breakdown that Dorothy had warned us about. A group of vehicles had surrounded a fuel truck at a rural gas station, and the situation was clearly tense. Armed men were directing the fuel distribution, and they were charging prices that were 10 times normal rates. Vehicles that could not pay the inflated prices were being turned away, regardless of their occupant circumstances. I drove past the gas station without stopping, not wanting to get involved in what appeared to be a potentially violent situation. However, the incident made it clear that the normal rules of commerce and social behavior were breaking down as the crisis intensified. We would need to be extremely careful about where and how we obtained supplies for the remainder of our journey. The radio broadcasts during the morning hours included increasingly desperate reports from evacuees who were trapped in traffic jams on the main highways. Some vehicles had been stationary for over 12 hours, and fuel shortages were stranding people at exposed locations. Several deaths from hypothermia were being reported, and emergency services were unable to reach many stranded vehicles due to the traffic congestion. These reports reinforced my decision to use alternative routes, but they also highlighted how precarious our situation had become. The margin for error was essentially zero. Any significant delay or mechanical problem would put us in the same desperate situation as the people trapped on the main highways. Our survival depended on everything continuing to work correctly for the remaining distance to safety. We approached the first refugee camp around noon, but the scene was not encouraging. Hundreds of vehicles were backed up on the access roads, and it was clear that the facility was not accepting new arrivals. Military personnel were turning away vehicles at checkpoints several miles from the actual camp. Signs posted at the roadblocks indicated that the camp had reached maximum capacity and that evacuees should continue to facilities further south. The traffic backup extended for miles, and many of the vehicles appeared to have been waiting for hours. Families were standing beside their cars, trying to decide whether to continue waiting or to move on to other camps. The frustration and desperation were visible, and I could see that conflicts were developing between evacuees who disagreed about the best course of action. Rather than joining the traffic jam, I used my knowledge of local roads to bypass the camp entirely and continue toward facilities further south. This decision was difficult because it meant passing up a potential source of help, but the evidence suggested that waiting would be futile and would consume fuel we could not afford to waste. The alternative route took us through rural areas where we encountered other evacuees who had made similar decisions. Some vehicles were traveling in informal convoys for mutual support, while others were moving independently like we were. The cooperation that had characterized the early stages of the evacuation was giving way to more individualistic survival strategies as resources became scarcer. We stopped at a small town to purchase fuel and supplies, but found that most businesses were closed or had sold out of essential items. The one gas station that was still operating was charging extreme prices and limiting sales to 5 gallons per vehicle. The rationing was understandable given the demand, but it meant that many vehicles would not have enough fuel to reach the next potential supply point. While I was purchasing fuel, Miguel struck up a conversation with a local resident, who provided valuable information about road conditions ahead. The man reported that the secondary highways we were planning to use were relatively clear of traffic, but were experiencing problems with abandoned vehicles and debris. More importantly, he warned us that some groups of stranded evacuees had become aggressive toward passing vehicles, attempting to force them to stop and share resources. This information was disturbing because it suggested that the social breakdown was accelerating and that we might face direct threats from other evacuees rather than just environmental hazards. Dorothy's earlier warnings about desperate people were proving to be accurate, and we would need to be prepared for potentially dangerous encounters with other survivors. I made the decision to continue our journey, but to avoid stopping unless absolutely necessary. We would drive straight through to the refugee camps in Central Texas, using our remaining supplies rather than risking encounters at gas stations or supply stops. The strategy would be demanding for our vehicle and passengers, but it would minimize our exposure to the increasing dangers of the evacuation route. The radio broadcast during the afternoon hours included reports that confirmed our decision to avoid the main routes. The traffic jams on the major highways had become essentially permanent, with some vehicles stranded for over 24 hours. Fuel supplies along these routes were completely exhausted, and emergency services were unable to provide assistance due to the congestion. Several violent incidents had been reported as desperation increased among stranded evacuees. We continued driving south through the afternoon, making steady progress on the secondary roads. The ashfall was lighter in the areas we were crossing, but the temperature was still well below normal. The radio weather reports indicated that we were staying ahead of the worst of the temperature drop, but the margin was continuing to decrease with each hour. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we encountered the situation that would test every skill I had developed as a professional driver. 3 vehicles were blocking the road ahead, positioned in a way that made it impossible to pass safely. Several men were standing beside the vehicles, and it was clear that they were stopping traffic deliberately rather than dealing with a mechanical problem. I slowed the car and assessed the situation carefully. The men appeared to be armed, and their positioning suggested that they were experienced in stopping vehicles. There were no alternative routes available, as the road passed through a narrow canyon with steep walls on both sides. We were essentially trapped with no option except to deal with whatever these men wanted. Harold quietly suggested that we turn around and find an alternative route, even if it meant traveling hundreds of miles out of our way. Miguel recommended that we try to negotiate with the men, offering to pay a toll or to share some of our supplies in exchange for passage. Maria was focused on keeping the children calm and out of sight, understanding that the presence of children might make the situation more dangerous. I made a decision based on my experience protecting clients who had faced similar threats in urban environments. I would approach the roadblock slowly and attempt to negotiate passage, but I would also be prepared to use evasive driving techniques if the situation became dangerous. The modifications I had made to my car for client protection. Work would be essential if we needed to escape from the roadblock. As we approached the roadblock, one of the men stepped forward and signaled for us to stop. He appeared to be the leader of the group, and his demeanor was businesslike rather than overtly threatening. He explained that they were collecting a toll from passing vehicles to fund their own evacuation efforts, and that cooperation would ensure safe passage through their area. The toll they demanded was substantial, equivalent to several $100s in cash or supplies. However, it was not unreasonable given the desperate circumstances, and paying it would be much safer than attempting to fight or flee. I agreed to pay the toll using cash from my emergency reserves rather than supplies that we would need for our own survival. The transaction was completed quickly and professionally, suggesting that the group had organized their roadblock operation carefully. They provided information about road conditions ahead and warned us about other groups that were operating similar checkpoints further south. The information was valuable, but it also made clear that this type of activity was becoming common. Along the evacuation routes, after passing through the roadblock, I realized that we had just experienced a preview of what the breakdown of social order would look like as the crisis continued. The men at the checkpoint were not criminals in the traditional sense. They were evacuees like ourselves who had chosen to use their position and resources to extract payment from other survivors. The line between legitimate self-defense and predatory behavior was becoming blurred. The radio broadcasts during the evening hours included reports of similar incidents occurring throughout the evacuation zone. Some groups were organizing cooperative efforts to share resources and provide mutual aid, while others were using force or coercion to take what they needed from other evacuees. The variation in responses reflected the breakdown of normal social institutions and the emergence of more primitive survival strategies. We continued driving through the evening, making good progress despite the challenging conditions. The secondary roads were becoming more crowded as other evacuees discovered the same alternative routes we were using. However, the traffic was still moving steadily, unlike the gridlock that was reported on the main highways. As darkness fell, we faced another critical decision point. The radio reports indicated that the refugee camps in Central Texas were still accepting new arrivals, but they were also becoming overcrowded rapidly. The competition for space was intense, and priority was being given to families with young children and elderly or disabled individuals. Our group qualified for priority treatment, but only if we could reach the camps before they closed their intake. The nearest camp was approximately 100 miles away, which represented about 3 hours of driving under current conditions. Our fuel supplies were adequate for the distance, but we would have no reserves if we encountered delays or needed to find alternative routes. The decision was essentially whether to risk everything on reaching this particular camp, or to continue further south toward facilities that might have more capacity but would require additional fuel we did not have. I chose to attempt reaching the nearest camp, reasoning that our group's composition would give us the best chance of gaining admission there. The alternative routes were becoming increasingly dangerous as social order continued to break down, and every additional hour of travel increased our exposure to both environmental hazards and human threats. The radio continued broadcasting updates as we made our final approach toward the refugee camp. The ice sheets were expanding faster than predicted, and the deadly cold was now affecting areas that had been safe just hours earlier. The secondary eruption at Yellowstone was imminent, and scientists were warning that it would make current conditions seem mild by comparison. As we drove through the night toward what we hoped would be safety, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. 4 days earlier, I had been a professional driver with a comfortable routine and predictable challenges. Now I was responsible for the survival of 10 people, including 6 children, and we were racing against both environmental disaster and social collapse to reach a refugee camp that might or might not have space for us. The headlights of our heavily loaded car cut through the ash-filled darkness as we approached the most critical checkpoint of our entire evacuation. Everything we had learned about survival, cooperation, and difficult choices would be tested in the next few hours as we discovered whether our journey would end in safety or become part of the larger tragedy that was unfolding across the continent. We reached the outskirts of the refugee camp at 2 a.m. on Saturday, exactly 7 days after the Yellowstone eruption had changed everything. The sight that greeted us was both hopeful and terrifying. Thousands of vehicles were arranged in organized rows across what had been farmland just days earlier. Military floodlights illuminated a sprawling tent city that seemed to stretch for miles in every direction. This was safety, but it was also a reminder of just how many people had lost everything in the span of a single week. The checkpoint ahead was manned by National Guard soldiers who were processing vehicles as quickly as possible while maintaining security protocols. A steady stream of cars, trucks, and buses was moving through the intake process, but I could see that some vehicles were being turned away. The selection criteria were not immediately obvious, but it was clear that space was limited and decisions were being made about who could stay and who would need to continue searching for shelter elsewhere. As we approached the checkpoint, I realized that our car presented both advantages and challenges for gaining admission. We had 10 people crammed into a vehicle designed for 5, which demonstrated our efficiency in using transportation resources. However, we also represented a significant burden on camp resources, especially with 6 children and 2 elderly adults who would require additional care and supplies. The soldier who approached our car was professional but clearly exhausted from processing evacuees for extended hours. He began by asking for identification from all passengers and information about our starting point and route. When I explained that we had traveled from Denver using secondary roads and had picked up stranded evacuees along the way, his attitude became more interested. Apparently, very few vehicles had successfully completed that particular route, and our arrival provided valuable information about road conditions in areas the military had not been able to monitor. The soldier was particularly interested in our encounter with the roadblock operators and the general breakdown of social order we had observed. He explained that the military was tracking these developments to determine where additional security resources might be needed. The information we provided would be used to help other evacuees avoid dangerous areas and to plan potential rescue operations for people stranded in those regions. After reviewing our documentation and circumstances, the soldier informed us that our group qualified for admission based on the number of children and elderly passengers we were carrying. However, he also explained that the camp was operating at maximum capacity and that conditions were challenging. Food was being rationed, medical supplies were limited, and housing consisted primarily of emergency shelters that provided basic protection from the elements, but little privacy or comfort. The admission process required us to abandon our car in a designated parking area and transfer all our belongings to a processing station where they would be inventoried and distributed. According to camp regulations, personal vehicles were not allowed within the camp perimeter for security and space management reasons. This meant giving up the modified sedan that had been our lifeline for the past 7 days, which felt like losing a member of our group. I retrieved the essential items from my car, including the emergency supplies that had sustained us throughout the journey and the cash reserves I had collected before leaving Denver. The hidden compartments and modifications that had been so important for our survival were no longer relevant, but the basic supplies they had contained would continue to be valuable in the camp environment. The processing station was efficiently organized but overwhelming in its scale. Hundreds of evacuees were moving through various stages of intake, registration, and housing assignment. Red Cross volunteers were providing initial medical screening and identifying people who needed immediate care. Social workers were helping to reunite families that had been separated during the evacuation and organizing temporary housing assignments based on group composition and special needs. Our group was assigned to a section of the camp designated for families with children. The housing consisted of large military tents that could accommodate multiple families, with shared cooking and sanitation facilities. The arrangement provided basic shelter and safety, but it also meant living in close quarters with strangers who were dealing with their own trauma and stress from the evacuation experience. Miguel and Maria were relieved to finally reach safety, but they were also anxious about the long-term implications of their situation. Their home in Denver was almost certainly uninhabitable, and Miguel's construction job no longer existed. They would need to rebuild their entire lives in a new location, probably using resources provided by government assistance programs that were being overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. Harold and Dorothy were struggling more with the transition to camp life. They had lost not only their home, but also the independence and routine that had defined their retirement years. The camp environment was chaotic and crowded, which was particularly difficult for elderly people who valued stability and familiar surroundings. However, they were also grateful to be alive and safe when so many other evacuees had not been as fortunate. The 3 children we had rescued from the broken-down car were being cared for by Red Cross volunteers, while efforts were made to locate their parents. The volunteer organizations were maintaining extensive databases of evacuees and were working to reunite families that had been separated during the chaotic evacuation process. The children were hopeful that their parents had reached safety, but the uncertainty was clearly affecting them emotionally. The elderly man we had rescued was receiving medical attention for hypothermia and exhaustion, but his condition was stable. The camp medical facilities were basic but adequate for treating the most common health problems among evacuees. More serious cases were being transported to hospitals in unaffected areas, though the transportation resources for medical evacuations were limited. During our first day in the camp, I had the opportunity to talk with other evacuees about their experiences during the evacuation. The stories were remarkably similar to our own, with people making difficult decisions about routes, resources, and who to help along the way. However, I also heard stories of evacuees who had not been as fortunate, including families who had been separated and people who had died from exposure or accidents during the journey. The camp administrators were working to provide accurate information about conditions in the areas evacuees had left behind. The news was sobering. Denver was reporting temperatures of 30 degrees below zero, with ash accumulation measured in feet rather than inches. The electrical grid had failed completely, and anyone who had remained in the city was presumed to be in mortal danger. Similar conditions were being reported across the entire northern tier of states. The secondary eruption at Yellowstone that scientists had been predicting occurred on our second day in the camp. The explosion was larger than the first eruption and sent additional massive ash clouds across the continent. The camp administrators immediately implemented additional emergency protocols, including rationing of food and water supplies that might need to last for extended periods if supply convoys could not reach the facility. The second eruption also accelerated the southward expansion of the ice sheets that were making vast areas of the continent uninhabitable. Weather monitoring stations were reporting that the habitable zone was continuing to shrink, and that even the refugee camps in Texas might eventually need to be relocated further south. The long-term implications of the disaster were becoming clearer, and they suggested that the changes to American society would be permanent rather than temporary. Living in the refugee camp was challenging in ways that were different from the dangers we had faced during the evacuation. The immediate threats to physical survival had been replaced by the psychological stress of displacement, uncertainty, and loss of autonomy. The camp provided safety and basic necessities, but it also represented the complete disruption of normal life for everyone who lived there. The camp population included people from every economic and social background who had been evacuated. From the affected areas, wealthy executives who had owned mansions were living in the same tents as minimum wage workers who had rented apartments. The disaster had been an equalizer that stripped away most of the social distinctions that normally separated people, creating a temporary community based on shared survival rather than economic status. The children in our group were adapting to camp life more easily than the adults, probably because they were more flexible and had fewer attachments to their previous lives. The camp schools were providing basic education and recreational activities that helped maintain some sense of normalcy. However, the psychological effects of the evacuation experience were still evident, and counseling services were available for people who needed help processing their trauma. The most difficult aspect of camp life was the uncertainty about the future. Government officials were honest about the fact that the disaster would have long-term effects that could last for years or decades. The areas we had evacuated from might never be habitable again, which meant that most evacuees would need to rebuild their lives completely in new locations. The refugee camps were intended as temporary facilities, but the scale of permanent relocation required would strain every system designed to help displaced populations. I spent time during our third day in the camp talking with military personnel and aid workers about the broader scope of the disaster. The information was restricted, but it was clear that the situation was even worse than the public reports suggested. Entire regions of the country were becoming uninhabitable, and the economic disruption was affecting global markets and international relations. The refugee crisis in the United States was creating secondary effects around the world. The camp administrators were also dealing with the reality that their facility might need to be relocated if the ice sheets continued expanding southward. Contingency plans were being developed for moving the entire population to camps further south, but the logistics of such an operation would be staggering. The possibility that we might need to evacuate again was not being discussed openly, but the preparation suggested that it was a real consideration. On our fourth day in the camp, I received information that would change my perspective on our entire journey. The Red Cross volunteers who had been working to reunite families brought news about the parents of the 3 children we had rescued. They had been found at another refugee camp in Arizona, and arrangements were being made to transport the children to reunite with them. The news was wonderful for the family, but it also provided closure for a decision that had weighed heavily on my conscience. The volunteer who delivered the news also provided information about the overall success rate of evacuation efforts. According to preliminary estimates, approximately 80% of people who had attempted to evacuate from the affected areas had reached safety successfully. However, this meant that hundreds of thousands of people had not survived the journey, or had become stranded in areas that were now inaccessible to rescue operations. The statistical perspective on our evacuation experience was sobering. Our group had been more successful than most, largely due to the early timing of our departure and the resources and skills that I had accumulated through my professional work. However, luck had also played a significant role, and many equally. Well-prepared evacuees had encountered circumstances that prevented them from reaching safety. The camp was also receiving evacuees who had made different choices during the evacuation and had experienced very different outcomes. Some had stayed on the main highways and had been trapped in traffic jams for days before being rescued by military convoys. Others had attempted to ride out the disaster in their homes and had been evacuated by emergency helicopter operations when conditions became life-threatening. Each evacuation story provided lessons about survival strategies and decision-making under extreme pressure. The common factors among successful evacuees included early recognition of the danger, adequate preparation and resources, flexibility in route planning, and willingness to help others when possible. However, the most important factor appeared to be timing, since the safe evacuation window had been much shorter than anyone had anticipated. During our 5th day in the camp, I began to think seriously about long-term plans for rebuilding my life. My professional driving business was obviously impossible to continue, since most of my client base had been dispersed by the evacuation, and the economic infrastructure that supported luxury services had been disrupted. However, the skills and experience I had gained during the evacuation suggested possibilities for new types of work related to emergency transportation and logistics. The government was beginning to organize massive reconstruction efforts that would require people with specialized skills in transportation, logistics, and emergency management. The experience of successfully evacuating a group of 10 people through dangerous conditions had given me credentials that would be valuable in these new roles. The disaster had destroyed my old career, but it had also created opportunities for new types of work that matched skills I had developed. The refugee camp was also becoming a center for organizing rescue operations to locate and evacuate people who were still stranded in the affected areas. Military units were being assembled to attempt reaching communities that had been cut off by the expanding ice sheets. Volunteer drivers with appropriate experience were being recruited to support these operations, and my background made me a candidate for this type of work. The decision to volunteer for rescue operations would mean leaving the safety of the refugee camp and returning to the dangerous conditions we had escaped from. However, it would also provide an opportunity to help other evacuees who were facing the same challenges we had overcome. The experience of being rescued ourselves created a moral obligation to help others who were still in danger. On our 7th day in the camp, exactly 1 week after the initial eruption at Yellowstone, I made the decision to volunteer for the rescue operations that were being organized. The choice reflected everything I had learned about survival, community, responsibility, and the real meaning of safety during our evacuation journey. True safety was not just about reaching a refugee camp or finding shelter from immediate dangers. It was about building communities that could help everyone survive and recover from disasters that changed the fundamental conditions of life. The evacuation from Denver had taught me that individual survival was possible, but ultimately meaningless without community survival. The skills and resources that had enabled our group to reach safety were only valuable when they were used to help others facing similar challenges. The disaster had destroyed the old world where I had been a private driver protecting wealthy clients, but it had also created a new world where those same skills could be used to protect entire communities of survivors who were rebuilding their lives after losing everything.